Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nora Valenzuela. I'm the chair of the World Affairs Council of Orange County. And on behalf of the Executive Board, Board of Trustees, and also our staff, wish to welcome all of you from all over US today. The staff just gave me the number of that we have over 200 people participating from across the nation. So that's very exciting. And it is indeed an honor to be able to co-sponsor and also to partner with our leading organization, World Affairs Council of America. And I'll be introducing the president and CEO very soon. First, I wish to thank Dr. Mark Johnson, who's the bronze sponsor of our event today. These have been very difficult times, as you know, for many organizations, especially small and nonprofits. So the support that you each provide is extremely helpful. So if any of you wish to have a sponsorship in the future, please do contact our office and our executive director will take care of you. With that, indeed, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce one of my old mentors. He doesn't know it, but he was my mentor for many years when I went to DC and watched me in action. So our beloved Mr. Bill Crawford, who's the CEO and the president of our National Council, which is the leading body and governance body of our organization. Bill, welcome, sir.
Thank you so much, Nora, and I wish everyone a happy new year. Who would have expected that we're still in the land of digital programming? I don't think we'll ever leave it, but we do look forward by the end of the year to come back together in person as we convene around the country. It's great to be doing this event with the World Affairs Council of Orange County and have it be our January cover-to-cover author event. And I'm so pleased that you're presenting Secretary Chertoff and Brian Cunningham on the topic of cybersecurity. We've had two important breaches recently, the Solarwinds hack of last year and the breach of the US Capitol this year, and what had gone on in the dark web to have that terrible event happen 2 weeks ago. So I'm really pleased that we could partner. And Secretary Chertoff, I just want to say you presented to our national conference several Novembers ago, and we hope to see you in person soon.
Hope so too.
Thank you very much. And over to Richard Downey, the program chair of WAC Orange County, to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. It's a real pleasure to have all of you on today for this presentation of the World Affairs Council of Orange County on the Solarwinds hack and cybersecurity in a digital age with Secretary Michael Chertoff. We want all of you to be a part of this conversation today. And the way you can do that is simply anytime throughout the presentation, you can go down to the chat box down below, or the Q&A box rather, and write a question. About 45 minutes to 50 minutes into the presentation, we'll switch to a period for Q&A when Rick Putnam, our Deputy Programs Committee Chair, will monitor the questions that you asked. So please, anytime throughout the presentation, feel free to ask a question, and we'll get to those to Secretary Chertoff later. It is truly a pleasure not only to have Secretary Chertoff with us, but we're honored to have Brian Cunningham today as our moderator, who is an international expert in many areas, including intelligence, technology, and surveillance issues. And we're delighted to have him with us. Brian is the executive director of the Cybersecurity Policy and Research Institute at the University of California, Irvine. And he has tremendous experience in this area. He's been at the White House, was the deputy legal assistant to Condoleezza Rice when she was the national security advisor. He has also served during the Clinton administration as a senior CIA officer, as well as a prosecutor. And Brian has been involved in developing many of the critical cybersecurity documents over the past few years, such as the Homeland Security Act, the first ever national security strategy to secure cyberspace, as well as the 9/11 Commission. So he is ideally suited to be the moderator for this presentation with Secretary Chertoff. And we are delighted to have you. Brian, please, if you'd introduce Secretary Chertoff. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Welcome, everyone. I understand there's a few hundred of you, so thanks very much for taking the time out of your day. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to both participate again with the World Affairs Council of Orange County, where I've had the pleasure of speaking a number of times. And it's a special pleasure to introduce Michael Chertoff. He probably needs no introduction, but I'm going to take a minute to give one anyway, on the off chance that some people are not familiar with the breadth of Secretary Chertoff's public service. Mike is currently the executive chairman and co-founder of the Chertoff Group. Strange coincidence that. A global advisory firm providing security risk management, business strategy, and mergers and acquisitions advisory services to clients seeking to secure and grow their enterprises. From 2005 to 2009, Secretary Chertoff served as, I believe, the second Secretary of the United States Department of Homeland Security, which, as you know, leads the government's efforts to prevent terrorism and enhance security, including cybersecurity. One of the things I've always admired about Secretary Chertoff is he previously had served not only as the head of the criminal division of the Department of Justice and an organized crime prosecutor in New York, but as a lifetime appointed judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. And for those of you who don't know, that is one of the most prestigious and important jobs a lawyer can have. And it's also a lifetime appointment, and also sometimes can lead to the United States Supreme Court. And Secretary Chertoff was asked by President Bush to step down from that lifetime position and take on what I think is the most thankless job in Washington, which is Secretary of Homeland Security, because you'd almost never get praised for the things that go right. And as somebody who was around when we created the Department of Homeland Security, there was a lot that needed to be made right when the secretary arrived, but also you get all the blame when things go wrong. So I've always admired that about Secretary Chertoff. He's also a published author, including his most recent book, Exploding Data, Reclaiming Our Cybersecurity in the Digital Age, which is available on Amazon, on the World Affairs website, and probably pretty much everywhere else. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to the discussion, Mr. Secretary. I think I'm going to call a little bit of an audible on our planned questions because of the place we are in history. You have, as I mentioned, taken on senior leadership roles in the United States government at times of extreme threat and stress. And so I think our audience would be curious, and if they're not, I am. What are President Biden and his senior officials feeling today?
Well, thank you, Brian. Let me first say I've enjoyed prior engagement with the World Affairs Councils, and I do look forward to an in-person attendance at an event, hopefully in the relatively near future. I have to say that the experience, particularly of the last 3 months and of the last month, is unprecedented in my experience. I've observed things like this in other parts of the world, but never in the United States. And, you know, part of the challenge the incoming team has is they got very little cooperation from the senior members of the outgoing administration. Now, I should emphasize, and this goes along with a statement that I think somebody made earlier, that a lot of the people who do the day in, day out, you know, work for the US government, who are public servants, are dedicated, and they are doing their job, and they are trying to facilitate the handoff and the work of the incoming administration. But it's certainly been made more difficult by the hesitancy of senior leadership in the outgoing administration to engage with their successors. That being said, President Biden has assembled a very experienced team. I'm happy to say I know many of their national security people, and they're not going to be easily rattled. They understand what it's like to face tremendous challenges. And in fact, back in 2009, when President Biden came in as vice president to President Obama, we actually had a scare on Inauguration Day that there might be a terrorist attack directed by overseas actors. And in the run-up to that, We had worked very closely with the incoming people, including my successor, to prepare and rehearse various scenarios. And I had then had to call the senior members of the transition and say, we actually have a credible threat. And everybody cooperated. I actually agreed to stay about 12 hours beyond my normal resignation date. So there would be continuity if something did occur on inauguration day. And happily, it turned out that the threat did not pan out. So I think they are daunted, but I think they've got a clear plan. They're determined to hit the ground running. They have a lot of experience. And so I'm very optimistic that while it won't be perfect, it'll be about as seamless as we could hope.
Excellent. I'm sure that makes folks feel a lot of relief. Now, getting back to our main topic, obviously anyone who is here read the title of the event and are familiar with the massive, presumably Russian attacks involving Solarwinds, and any IT professionals worth us have scoured their systems as a result. And just to set the stage for the rest of our discussions, would you maybe just give us your take on how bad this attack is actually likely to turn out to be, specifically for U.S. national and economic security, and maybe compare it to some of the recent attacks?
I think this is going to be a very damaging attack, not because, as far as I know, it has yet been used to mobilize an attack on industrial control systems, which would actually have a physical effect, but because the scope and the breadth of the attack and the number of potential targets is enormous. And to understand the significance of this is about what we call the supply chain. If instead of attacking your intended target, you go to someone who is supplying a necessary piece of software and hardware, and you embed within that a backdoor or a vulnerability that can later be seized upon to penetrate a target, you can really scale up an attack. And that's what happened here. Apparently, Solarwinds creates a network management system which has senior access privileges to any network it's put upon. And that means that once you understand what the vulnerability is in that network software, you can basically use it as a key to unlock all kinds of targets. Now, we don't know how many targets have been unlocked. I think what was reported publicly was only a small number of actual targets were hit. But the point is, this is now lurking in everybody's networks. And that means there's going to have to be a real push to examine to make sure that it doesn't still exist, and that anything that might have been embedded as a result of downloading it has also been identified and expunged. So this is going to be very labor intensive, and it illustrates the critical importance of making sure that when you're dealing with cybersecurity, you look all the way down your supply chain at the people who are contractors, who sell you hardware, who sell you software, because any vulnerability that comes that way is something that will circumvent your normal defenses and create a real open door for some bad action.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think one thing that a lot of folks don't quite understand about modern cyber attack capability is, in a traditional war, it's pretty easy to tell whether somebody's spying on you or whether they're blowing up a building as an act of war. With a lot of the software, though, a lot of times the difference between espionage and war can just be a mouse click, whether you decide to activate the destructive parts of your malware that you've left behind. What do you think the administration's, putting aside for a second the private sector, what do you think their top, let's say, 3 responses should be in terms of both cleaning up this mess from Solarwinds and also deterring the use of any little traps that might have been left behind?
Well, first of all, I think that they're going to need to make sure they check, I'm sure they're doing this, any classified or sensitive networks that are carrying classified material or sensitive government material, to make sure those are secure. I also have to say, for the incoming administration, I would really be scrubbing the White House IT system and the systems of the people who are coming into the cabinet positions to make sure there's nothing left behind there that's going to give the Russians the opportunity to scope out what we're planning to do. More generally, I think there are 2 kinds of responses in terms of deterrence. to the extent this is classic espionage, we don't treat it as an act of war. We treat it as spying that can be punished or can be responded to, but it doesn't usually escalate to a level of actual conflict. And this could be disabling the attack vectors. It could be attempting to penetrate and spy on the Russian agents who actually carried this out, and then perhaps either indicting them, as we've done in the past, although you're not going to see any of these people in a US courtroom, or publicizing it, or in some way pushing back in terms of shining light on this. The more serious issue would be if, as you point out earlier, this vulnerability were exploited to actually carry out an attack that had a physical effect, shut down part of the power grid, shut down a water system, resulted perhaps even in the loss of life. That would be regarded, I think, more likely as an act of actual conflict. And I think President Biden has made clear he believes we need to have a strong response to deter that. And that might be a response in kind. So I think those are all options that are on the table. The other thing which we have done in the past is using sanctions, economic sanctions, travel sanctions, things of that sort are one of the responses you can use to deter bad activity like this. But again, you have to calibrate it depending on the actual harm.
Moving a little bit for a minute off of Solarwinds, although onto a related topic, there's a lot of speculation that Russia was very strategic in the way they behaved in the run-up to the 2020 election, that sort of while everyone's eyes were on the ball of them trying to disrupt the elections, either electronically or through propaganda and disinformation, they instead launched Solarwinds. And I guess we're not going to know whether or not that happened, maybe ever, but certainly not for some time. But focusing on the propaganda and disinformation for a second, how does the challenge of countering extremism and extremist violence change when the bad actors are not foreign governments like the Russians, but Americans ourselves?
Well, so there are several levels of dealing with this. And first, I want to say, the Russians may have been less active in the disinformation area because we had domestic actors doing their work for them. But I will say that in the past, they've not only been trying to affect how people vote or not vote, but they've actually used their cyber capabilities to promote and instigate violence. They did this a few years ago when there was conflict between the people who were Black Lives Matter demonstrators and police. And so that continues to be an existing challenge. And I've recently read a report in the last day or so indicating that there is Russian disinformation aimed at undermining US confidence in vaccines and causing people to be afraid to be vaccinated. So their general approach, which I think, to be honest, goes back to the communist days, is to disrupt public confidence in government and in government institutions, not limited to the election, but capable of being used with respect to any controversial matter. Now, the issue with US disinformation is this. We have free speech, and there's a lot of controversy around the social media platforms shutting down speech that is viewed by some as controversial and by others as their right to speak. And that's why you see people, particularly on the right side of the spectrum, talking now about repealing the immunity that the platforms have for what they allow to be posted on their networks because of anger about the fact they feel there's been censorship. But here's the problem. First of all, one person's censorship is another person's protect against violence. It's quite clear to me that from a standpoint of the First Amendment, inciting violence by saying, go hurt that person is not protected by the First Amendment. And I think the platforms have every right and obligation to shut down instigation of violence. The harder issue is controversial viewpoints. If it's not instigation, we are understandably reluctant to suppress content by Americans who are exercising free speech. But there are things the platforms can do that would be useful. For one thing, the algorithms which currently encourage people who read a controversial statement to follow even more controversial iterations has the tendency to drive extreme behavior and extreme outlooks, because you click on something maybe out of curiosity, and then you get recommendations for things that are more and more intense. From the platform standpoint, they like that because they want you to linger on the platform. That's revenue. But what that tends to do is drive you away from consensus positions and into the arms of my way or the highway, kind of extreme positions. And so I think dealing with the algorithms, particularly those that are not commercial but are used for political advertising, is going to be a sensitive but important discussion for the next year or so.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out for the non-constitutional lawyers among us that the First Amendment protects us from government censorship of speech, not from private company censorship from speech. Although obviously private companies doing it can have at least as negative effect on our society, and arguably maybe worse, because nobody elected Mark Zuckerberg to anything. I wonder though, if there's a strategy that could help with the extremism problem, but without fatally damaging the advertising driven model of some of these social media sites, where essentially, and again, this is leaving a lot of judgment in the hands of private actors, but you don't reward or create advertising revenue for lingering on sites that are opinion sites, as opposed to, you know, a shopping channel or watching a movie or something like that. I know we didn't talk about this. It just occurred to me while we were speaking, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, Brian, that's exactly the kind of thing we need to look at. You don't want to interfere with people's ability to explore things they want to explore within reason, if it's not incitement or child pornography. But you don't want to create an economic incentive to drive misbehavior. And it may wind up being an issue of essentially cutting back on some of the advertising revenue if it's derived from lingering on certain categories of sites. And maybe this is something that platforms need to consider undertaking on their own. And I know there's a lot of introspection now going on in Silicon Valley in this respect. So stay tuned, but this is going to be, I'm sure, quite an area of discussion.
And we probably should move on, but just one other historical note. I know you mentioned this to me the other day, and that is, you know, to a large extent, we've done Russia's work for them. You know, they've been in the business of trying to disrupt our society and prove that democracy doesn't work forever. Often, you know, secretly supporting both sides of controversial issues just to really rile us up. And they've done an excellent job of that. But it didn't start with social media. I mean, they did propaganda operations in newspapers when they were the Soviet Union. And we as Americans have been more and more, as you've said, pushing ourselves into separate corners. And this is obviously reflected in the way the mainstream media and cable have developed. Is there a way back from that other than just maybe all of us taking a beat and trying to listen to some viewpoints we disagree with from time to time?
Well, Brian, I think you're exactly right. You pointed out something, excuse me, that's often overlooked in the criticism of social media, which is that actually the polarization of news occurred before we had internet platforms. It goes back to talk radio, and when television moved away from a few networks and the fairness doctrine was repealed and we got multiple cable channels, it suddenly became possible for people to curate their own news, to hear or read or listen to only what validated their beliefs. And again, because advertising is the basic business model of mainstream media, they rapidly learned that by featuring certain kinds of very extreme viewpoints, a network or a cable television or talk radio could actually get a fair number of listeners, which would drive up their advertising revenue. So this is not a social media phenomenon by any means. It is part of the fragmentation of news sources in general. Now, honestly, I don't think we're going to be able to put that genie back in the bottle in the sense of restricting that. Some of this is educational. And some of it, and this may start in schools, where you teach people to understand when they're being manipulated because someone wants to make money off of you. And that doesn't work with everybody, but a lot of people, when they say, oh, I'm getting this diet of things because the person propagating it is making money off me, that may create a certain amount of judicious skepticism, which I think is at least partly an antidote to what we're seeing now.
Yeah, I agree. And I also wonder, having two young adult daughters, if we could somehow gamify this, the bug bounty programs that companies offer to pay hackers for finding flaws in their software. I wonder if you could almost create contests or rewards for people to identify disinformation on their own and then feel sort of invested.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'll also tell you, look, the real world does intrude in this. So I was reading a report today. As you all know, there's a growing group of people who believe in this QAnon massive conspiracy theory involving how President Trump was going to wind up arresting all the Democrats and they're all going to be reptiles. And I can't even recapitulate what the theory is. But apparently, a lot of these people were tuned in watching the inauguration, waiting for something to happen that would wind up arresting the incoming administration and declaring Donald Trump is president again. And when it didn't happen, they were dumbfounded. And then you started to see discussion on the platforms. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe we were lied to. So, I mean, sometimes reality does have the effect of causing people to take a deep breath and saying, wow, we need to maybe rethink this. But I think education is clearly a part of this.
It almost reminds me of the apocalyptic religious sects who used to predict the world will end on December 3rd, 1978. And then after a few of those passed and they started to lose adherence, they just said, well, it's going to happen soon. It's going to happen one day soon.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
But lifting the lens a little bit now and moving on to sort of more general topics, I'm putting in the link in the chat a link to your excellent most recent book. And in that book, you start off by asking, what is the internet? And I'm wondering, why did you start there? And what is the internet in your view?
Well, what I wanted to do is to get people to think back to first principles, because what has happened is, without consciousness on the part of many people, the internet has changed from what it originally was designed to be, which is a resilient communication system that could be used by the military and people who are working with the military in case of some kind of a devastating attack, into a major commercial and social tool, which now has really undergirded almost everything we do in society, even all the more so, to be candid, after the virus. So we need to understand that without necessarily building the internet with privacy as part of the design, because the original users were all trusted members of the military or academics, we wound up slouching into an environment where there are a lot of bad actors who can use the internet or use it as a way of getting your data and then monetizing the data, which is a little bit similar to what we talked about earlier. And some people have described data now as the new gold or the new oil. It is the most precious asset from a financial standpoint. And needless to say, that attracts a lot of people who want to exploit it. So to me, as we understand how the internet has evolved, we have a better sense of why it was not purpose-built to deal with some of the challenges we have now. And therefore, we've got to do some retrofitting.
Yeah, there's that expression, if you're online and you don't know what the product is, it's you. And we seem, I have to say, somewhat skeptically that we haven't really learned too many lessons from, as you say, slouching into the lack of privacy protections. One of the things we're doing a lot of work on at the Cybersecurity Policy and Research Institute is connected device or Internet of Things security. And even though we have the example of building the internet without enough privacy and security, it seems like even today, lots of inventors and entrepreneurs are still building connected devices without security. But I think I think one difference there is I think it is in some ways easier to retrofit security onto those devices. Do you have any kind of thoughts on what the industry should be doing to balance securing the devices with profit?
Well, I think what concerns me is that we're putting devices that out there that don't even have minimal security. And that means things like updates, being able to change the password to your own password, patches, things of that sort. And many of these things are viewed as being essentially commodities. Refrigerators, clocks, things of that sort. But as we've seen, these can be entryways into the network for sensitive things. There was an event some years back from a major non-governmental institution in Washington that found its database hacked by an overseas actor because a thermostat in a building was vulnerable and was connected to the network. So I think we're going to need to put in place some basic safety standards. And maybe we need something like the Underwriters Laboratory certification. So before you buy a clock or a refrigerator that is, quote, smart, you can determine whether they've at least made the basic security capabilities part of the product so that you can avoid the easiest low-hanging fruit for bad guys.
Yeah. Well, there's so much good stuff in your book. We could spend hours on it. I don't want to run us over time. So I'm going to skip a little bit down the list that we talked about. In your book, you talk about this notion, I love the way you phrased it, quote unquote, rolling out the red carpet for Big Brother. How are we doing that, and how do we stop doing it? Or do we?
We have become our own big brothers in many ways. And what we've done is, not only are we putting a lot of things online, but other people who are observing us, listening to us, or know us are putting things about us online. And because increasingly either the host platform is gathering all kinds of different data, or data is being sold to data brokers, the ability to aggregate this data goes far beyond what most people are aware of. So I might say, I'm very careful about what I post, and if I'm explaining where I am, and maybe even I turn off my locational data so that no one can follow me around. But everybody I encounter may wind up posting something or in some ways recording data, and then that may be uploaded ultimately to the cloud and can be aggregated together. I'm sure, for example, there are people watching this who might post something, and that will become not only data that's relevant to them, but data that's relevant to me. So what we've done is we've created an infrastructure that allows for much more massive surveillance than what George Orwell imagined when he wrote 1984.
Right.
And in many cases, the aggregator is a private sector actor, not even a government actor, that's very, very highly restricted. And that's one of the reasons that I think there's been discussion, particularly in Europe, but also in California, about changing the law to move from a model where we try to protect privacy by keeping things concealed and shutting the door to surveillance, to one that recognizes inevitably, just by living, we're going to generate mountains of data. And therefore, the emphasis ought to change to giving you, as the subject of data, the right to have some say into how the data is.
Well, that's a great segue. My next question was, particularly since a lot of our viewers are in California, do you feel like the California Consumer Privacy Act, as recently amended by the Privacy Rights Act, reflects this shift in focus from privacy to autonomy, and how so?
Well, so I'm not an expert in California law, but it seems to me it's modeled more or less on the general data privacy regulation, which the Europeans rolled out. And what the Europeans perceived, and I think this is actually corrected in the book, I explain why I've moved to this point of view, is that the horse is out of the barn on keeping your data from prying eyes, because even if you don't post anything, everybody around you is posting things, and it can all be collected together. So maybe what we need to do is to give you the right to know when someone has your data, and to have some say in how that's used or how it's transmitted or transferred to somebody else. Now, as you mentioned, I talked about this as relating not really to privacy in the sense we think about it, about keeping things undercover, but as autonomy. That when a lot of data is collected about everything you do, you begin to lose your freedom. What did I mean by that? And we're seeing it already. I mean, some of my predictions in the book already have been outpaced. If you are having somebody record one way or another everything you buy, where you eat, what you drink, where you drive, when you go to sleep, how much exercise you get, you're now creating ultimately a database of everything you do in your life. Now, what happens when your insurance company says, you didn't get a lot of sleep last night, and you ate a big, piece of pie, and you also had a drink. So we think that you're not living healthy. We're going to raise your premiums. And pretty soon you say to yourself, everything I eat or do, someone's going to be looking at me and judging me and maybe even retaliating against me or in some way penalizing me. And to me, that's not Big Brother. That's like Big Nanny literally sitting on your shoulder. Now, I understand there are some people who say, well, what's wrong with that? We want to encourage good conduct. But part of freedom is the freedom to experiment, to make mistakes, and to make personal choices. And before you give that up lightly, understand what it would be like to live under a microscope 24 hours a day.
Yeah, and we've already, as you suggest, we've already seen this in car insurance, where, in fact, I got one this morning from Allstate. They want me to opt in to letting them monitor my driving habits, ostensibly so they can lower my rate. But I'm not sure it's always a one-way ratchet there.
Correct.
At the Institute, we've sponsored some scholarship, which is going to be coming out in the spring around the comparisons of the privacy protections between the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe and the California Consumer Privacy Act. And I think a headline is going to be, not to scoop the author, but I think one headline is going to be, in some ways, California is now ahead of Europe in protecting autonomy as opposed to the more traditional concepts of privacy. And I know you and I have both been in negotiations with the Europeans where we've been lectured about our privacy inadequacy in the United States. So I just want to put a little plug in for California there. You mentioned insurance. Let me just quickly go to that and ask you, I think probably many of our viewers have had the experience of purchasing cyber insurance for their businesses. And I wonder what your thoughts are, if any, about whether cyber insurance companies are becoming or should become sort of de facto regulators of cybersecurity measures by either offering discounts if you do the right thing, or penalizing you or not giving you coverage if you're not a good cyber citizen.
Well, Brian, I wouldn't make them regulators, but I do think that financial incentives to promote cybersecurity are a useful tool in the insurance industry and can do that both by offering coverage limits and by offering premium reductions. Now, there are some things, however, with really high consequences that may be beyond the capability of an insurance company to underwrite. And, we had this with terrorism when Congress passed TRIA, which was a reinsurance asset reinsurance capability that the government operates, so that if a terrorist attack were like another, God forbid, 9/11, no insurance company would be able to insure against it. So TRIA would come in and take up the slack. Another interesting model that I think could be used in cyber is the Safety Act. The Safety Act is, again, a counterterrorism law that says if you create a technology or implement a technology that the Department of Homeland Security certifies is a good counterterrorism technology or resilience technology, and then you wind up getting attacked, there is a limit to the liability you can be required to assume, and there can't be punitive damages. And that creates an incentive for investors and for companies to shop for approved technologies that will increase their security, because there's going to be an economic benefit to them in terms of what they might have to face from a liability standpoint. I think applying that model to cyber would again promote companies embedding cybersecurity without feeling that they're just throwing their money away because it's not clear it's going to help them.
Yeah, very interesting. And I know you were there at the creation of both of those programs. Is there any, are you aware of any kind of real world data on how they've worked out? I mean, obviously, thank God we haven't had another 9/11, so maybe we don't know how TRIA worked out, but I know Congress has to reauthorize that every couple of years. And what's your sense, both from when you were the secretary and working with companies, on how industry, let me rephrase, how does industry feel about those two programs and how much have they used them?
Well, I think TRIA has mainly been of interest to the insurance companies, and so I really can't speak to that. But I think the Safety Act has been welcomed by people who want to invest in and market approved counterterrorism security solutions, and also for those in businesses where they're facing a real risk and they want to be able to limit their liability. So I think these are both programs that have been favorably reviewed. As you point out, we haven't had a serious, very high consequence terrorist attack, although we've had some small ones. And so we haven't really road tested TRIA, and we haven't really road tested the Safety Act, although maybe a few examples where that has been used to limit some liability.
Interesting. I think we probably have time for about one more big topic before we switch to questions from our viewers. And I know you write extensively about issues related to cyber warfare and active defense, both by the government and by private companies. I guess two questions to start off the discussion. One, there's certainly a school of thought, and I guess I would put myself in this category, that part of the reason why the Russians and others have been so brazen, both in their election interference and in their more general cyber attacks, is, at least from public view, it doesn't appear that President Obama or President Trump really did much to deter, particularly Russia. So I guess, A, do you agree with that? And I'm only excluding President Bush, who we both worked for, because I don't think the issue was really live back then.
I agree.
As much. But A, what can the government and should the government do? And then maybe more interestingly, do you see a time when private actors will be able to do more active defense on their own legally? Because right now, for everyone's knowledge, it's almost impossible to do any real active defense without violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
Yeah, so first of all, what we mean by active defense is actually going to someone else's network to shut it down or cause some damage there, either to prevent further attacks or even to retaliate. I think in terms of what we've seen with disinformation, and bear in mind, that's not at the level of actual conflict where you might have loss of life. What we've seen are indictments. I think there were some indictments of Russians, which are mainly embarrassing, but they're not likely to get them in front of a courtroom. I think we've seen some sanctions. And there was reporting in the press, and I can't validate it, that in the run-up to 2018, because of the experience of 2016, the US government did take down the Russian disinformation factory, the Internet Research Agency, for a short period of time as a warning shot. If you do this, we're going to wind up shutting you down. But as we pointed out, these days, the Russians hardly have to be engaged in this because we're doing a lot of it ourselves. Now, in terms of active defense by the private sector, by which we sometimes mean hackback, like can a private company that's been attacked and had its data stolen, can they attack the attacker and either reclaim their data or hurt the attacker in some way? And I think that's a really bad idea. If someone robs your house, you can defend yourself in the house, but you're not allowed to go to their house with a gun and steal their stuff back. You have to call the police. And there's a real risk with active defense, which is you could get an escalation out of control, or the entity hacking back could inadvertently damage a third party. And then you would have astronomical liability as well as potential criminal charges. So I think that this is in the category of don't try this at home. The government may have to be more active in how it retaliates. And I think there is discussion moving in that direction, but I would not have the private sector on its own engaging in this.
What about a more limited, well, I wouldn't even call it hackback. What about something like, and by the way, for everyone listening, we can't give you legal advice, but I'm just saying, my own view is that under the Federal Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, even what I'm about to say could be a violation. But just in terms of the good or badness of the idea, what about something like digital fingerprinting, or making it so that if I get sensitive electronic documents taken out of my firewall, they self-destruct in the other guy's server? Are you opposed to that as well?
Well, so I mean, again, I'm not going to be a lawyer here, but there is, digital rights management is a program that allows you to basically say, in order to access a digital object, you have to have permission. And that can be accomplished through encryption. So there are things you can certainly do with your data that would make it useless to somebody trying to steal it. If you encrypt it, or you have digital rights management, or you wrap it in some kind of a protective wrapper that requires a certain kind of key to open, that would at least make it unusable. But of course, some of what you're talking about involves not stealing the data, but propagating false data, or perhaps even attacking critical infrastructure.
Right. Okay. One last question, just because I have the moderator's privilege and I love pirates. Do you think there might be a time coming when privateering in cyberspace might become prevalent? That is, the government authorizing and providing oversight of private companies doing some of these more active hackback type of operations?
I mean, I could imagine a circumstance where a private sector entity is hired by the government, supervised by the government, and acts like an agent of the government, at least for certain kinds of activities. But then there are all kinds of legal issues, whether under foreign law, that would expose the private contractor to criminal or civil liability. So I think even there, I'm hesitant about how likely that is to be occurring in the near future.
So I think for now, we both put that in the category of don't try this at home.
Exactly right.
What about, I didn't research this and I didn't mention it, but I think it's Estonia. One of the Estonia, Lithuania, or Latvia created something like a cyber civil defense corps or National Guard, where IT security personnel and private companies actually get government training and can be deputized in time of emergency. I tend to be skeptical that the American ethos, and particularly the kind of hacker culture, would put up with that. But what do you think about that concept?
Well, and that may be interesting to explore. I think Senator Wyden at some point, I think, may have suggested something like that years ago. And there might be some interest in having a group of people who are trained to, when the appropriate authority comes, could be deputized to help, again, to defend networks, or to look at networks and detect malware as a way of scaling up against a major attack. They'd have to be properly trained, and there'd have to be some, clear limitations on what they can do and can't do. And of course, they'd have to have the permission of the entity that was under attack to, come in and be part of the defense. But I think that's something that increasingly may be looked at.
Excellent. Well, I could go on for hours. I think we're getting to the time when we may want to take some questions from our viewers. Are we there yet, team, or not?
We are. Thank you, Director Cunningham, and thank you, Secretary Chertoff. It was a wonderful back and forth. And again, I'm Rick Putnam, Vice Chair of the Programs Committee, and I'm going to run through our questions from the panelists in a very, very direct way. So the questions might bounce around a bit, but feel free to address them as you wish. And I'll just take the first one directly from an audience member. Will the extremist or militia groups that were previously removed from the watch list by the previous administration now be put back on the FBI list?
I can't speak for the FBI, but I do think that increasingly, certainly in terms of things like flying or access to certain facilities, there will be some kind of a watch list. And, it always gets tricky with American citizens. But on the other hand, we've recognized that when you're dealing with global jihadi groups, if there are Americans who are participating in that, you can put them on a watch list. So there'll be all kinds of legal hurdles that have to be mounted. But I do think we will see some move in that direction.
I haven't yet had the opportunity to read your book, but one specific question was, how much time did it take for you to write it?
It's an interesting question. I did it on airplanes back in the days when we could travel for business and on vacation. And I think it took me maybe slightly less than a year, just taking it, a chunk at a time. And I guess the ideas had been percolating for a while. And so it was actually easier and more enjoyable than I would have thought before I started.
Great. Do you think any dangers arise from domestic criminal organizations that might be working freelance for hostile governments outside the U.S.?
Absolutely. I think increasingly adversary governments use private people to carry out their missions. We've seen that with the Russians who essentially deputize organized crime groups to do some of the hacking on their behalf. You can see this if you look at some of the indictments. And the deal is basically, as long as these groups stay out of attacking Russians, they're free to go do whatever they want in terms of committing crimes, but they have to be available to help the Russians. Do I believe you could get American criminal groups that would do this? Yeah, I can't rule that out. Some might be too patriotic, but also some of them might not understand who they were really working for. So I think you have to look at domestic extensions of this kind of activity.
Yeah, that was the point I was going to add, is that the Soviet KGB used to have this term "useful idiot," and it actually didn't say anything about the intelligence of the person who was being used. It just meant they didn't know who they were working for, and they didn't know why they were doing what they were doing, and that could be either actively disguising that it's a Russian intelligence or Chinese intelligence agency, or it could just mean just going out and hiring companies without any direct contact with what we used to call cutouts in the intelligence business. So, Better America LLC in Delaware is really run in Leningrad, and it can be done. So it's very difficult to even find that out.
I suppose that might also be extended to just the 1,000 Talents program that China has effectively deployed across the U.S. as well. Another question, and this is a larger, more general and macro one, but given everything that we've been through, but now we're looking at a post-January 6th era of heightened concerns over domestic terrorism. What is the proper balance, or how is the balance going to change or shift between security, privacy, and free speech in this post-January 6th world?
Well, I'll start out. I think that's a great and difficult question. And we often find ourselves immediately reacting to something, and then after things settle down, we maybe dial it back a little bit or recalibrate. So I do think we don't want to seriously impair free speech, but the two areas where I do think you'll see some serious consideration are, how do we monitor what goes on in social media publicly to focus on people who might be advertising absolutely openly that they're going to commit acts of violence. One of the things that's striking about what we've seen since the 6th are the number of people who literally videotape themselves committing crimes and then upload it. Now, it's often uploaded to a public forum, so you're not necessarily dealing with a constitutional issue of search and seizure. The issue then becomes, does even the fact of monitoring public forums inhibit free speech? And there you're going to have to draw a line between incitement to violence versus political viewpoints. For example, if someone wants to say, well, I think the election was stolen, that itself may not be incitement. But if you say we're going to punish those people, or let's go after them, that might cross the line. So I suspect this is going to be a feast for lawyers trying to fine tune the rules so that we don't have people making threats without our being aware of it. But at the same time, we don't go too far in the other direction.
Let me just add, I think this is an incredibly important and difficult question. It's not a new question, though. We faced the same type of issue after 9/11. And not to get too wonkish about it, but the overseas intelligence agencies like the CIA historically have been governed by an entirely different set of rules than a domestic police/intelligence agency like the FBI. And there were all kinds of legal and policy firewalls built so that those two worlds would not intersect. And I think most reasonable observers, and certainly the 9/11 Commission, concluded that that divide between foreign intelligence and domestic law enforcement and national security was a principal reason why 9/11 was not detected and stopped. And it's sort of been turned on its head in the last decade, because after a lot of the revelations by Edward Snowden, there started this kind of movement in Europe of, why do Americans get the more benefit from American law than Europeans? Why shouldn't we all be treated the same when it comes to surveillance and government action? And so in a weird way, you sort of have the left and the right circling around to the same place. And my own view, having thought about this for a long time, is, America is an exceptional place, in my opinion, and we fought for our rights and we deserve them. And I don't have a problem if we have more rights in our own country than some other folks. But I do think we really need to start thinking more about the crime and less about the criminal. So if a non-politicized law enforcement agency sees behavior by a domestic organization that, if they were a foreign terrorist organization, they would be punished and caught, I kind of feel like the same standards should apply. You shouldn't get a free pass on terrorism because you're an American.
I'd agree with that. And maybe related, another question: how have U.S. intelligence agencies actually fared, Secretary, in your estimation, during the last 4 years, under assault from foreign powers, and also disparagement from the chief executive?
Well, I think that the disparagement by Donald Trump has been very hurtful. The good news is, I think at least the CIA and the FBI under Chris Wray and CISA at DHS were helmed by people who, by and large, were professional and did not compromise their intelligence analytic function or collection function in a way that would have been undermining the country's security. I think the problem is a lot of the intelligence never was appreciated or received or acted upon by the policymakers in the White House because they didn't like the message. And that's particularly true with anything to do with the Russians. Oddly, they were perfectly happy to get negative intelligence about China, but because of Donald Trump's apparent love affair with Vladimir Putin, the message out of the White House was, we don't want to hear bad stuff about Russia. But I think the agencies continue to function. I think the people who were there are professional. And now that we're going to have new leadership, I think Bill Burns will be terrific at CIA. I think Avril Haines is very well respected. Alan Mayorkas will be a good DHS secretary. I think that we'll have more synchronicity between policymaking and intelligence, which will be all to the good.
Yeah, let me say a couple things about this, because this might be the one area that I feel slightly more qualified than the secretary to talk about, because I served in the trenches at the CIA for about half my career, both as an intelligence officer and an analyst. And I will say I'm a little bit of two minds about this. On the one hand, it is incredibly damaging to have, if you're a career intelligence or law enforcement or national security official, to not feel like the White House and the administration has your back. And one of the most damaging things that I think President Trump did in this regard is when he stood on a stage with Vladimir Putin and said he believed Putin over his own intelligence agencies. On the other hand, I don't believe there's any such thing as a deep state. I don't think there are a bunch of career people drilled into agencies to try to, take down former President Trump. But I do know that there is a tendency on the part of career people to sort of feel like, well, you know, presidents and secretaries of Homeland Security and CIA directors come and go, and we're the real government, and we're the ones who have the nation's best interests at heart, and we are the ones who get to set policy and frustrate policy that we don't like. I've seen this with Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. And so I do think it's important to realize that elected officials get to make these decisions on what to do with the intelligence they get. And they're not necessarily evil or badly motivated people if they don't agree with their intelligence agencies. But what should never happen is for a president to privately or publicly declare that he doesn't have the back of our career officials.
Totally agree. Yeah.
End of speech.
Do we need to do what do we need to do to create a stronger cyber capacity from our own perspective? And I'm going to add in a question, a curious question for myself. Can't we just zap someone's electrical grid or the troll farm in Moscow and just put it all out of business?
Well, that's a good way to start a war. And I think the issue of escalation is one of the most challenging when it comes to deterrence. How do you make sure you don't cross the line into an outbreak that winds up killing people or seriously damaging property or the economy? I think, I guess I would say this, we're living through this pandemic, and I don't think it's a coincidence that we talk about a coronavirus and we talk about viruses with cyber, because in many ways there are parallels in the way we think of these things. For a lot of people, both a coronavirus and a cyber virus is an alien concept. It's not a threat that they're intuitively comfortable with or understand. But it also, in both cases, this is about managing the risk, not eliminating it. There is no perfect way to guarantee you never get sick, and there's no perfect way to guarantee you won't get infected in cyberspace. The key is to build resilience and multiple layers of defense. And giving people a realistic expectation of what the architecture of security is, I think would do a lot to drive good behavior. I think what frustrates good behavior is when people have an unrealistic expectation and they get so many different conflicting pieces of advice that they throw their hands up and go, I can't figure out what's right. I'm just going to hope for the best. And we see that now in the virus as well. So I do think how you present it and how you educate people is very important.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we've seen a striking example with the virus and mask wearing of how uncomfortable most people are with actually seeing science in action, right? I said actually 3 times in the last paragraph. I don't believe that, our government officials lied to us when they said at the beginning of the pandemic, not only do you not need masks, but don't go buy them. And then all of a sudden they said, everybody needs to mask up. I think that was us watching the messy process of science in action, because as the data changed, what you would expect is people driven by science change their positions on things. But it's incredibly difficult and frustrating to the average person. And I think creates a lot of suspicion and cynicism about our government. So I think, and I don't know how to do this, but we're thinking about this at the Cybersecurity Institute. We really need to have some basic education on lots of the issues of cybersecurity and just even the internet, because I think people have a lot of misunderstandings. And as the secretary said, that can lead to frustration and inaction. Let me just add one thing on the risk of escalation in terms of cyber deterrence by countries. I think I was pretty explicit earlier in saying I don't think our last couple of presidents have done enough to deter Putin in particular, but it is, as the secretary says, fraught with extreme risk. And to me, one of the biggest risks is when if we continue in the situation where we are now, where there's no real agreement among the major powers in the world on how much damage constitutes an act of war that would enable you to conduct an armed response when you hit that threshold. And that gap in understanding is extremely dangerous, because imagine if Kim Jong-un in North Korea thinks that disabling a power grid in one state is not, and I'm not, by the way, saying he can do that. I don't know if he can or not, but suppose he thinks, well, that's not going to provoke an armed response from the United States because it doesn't get to that threshold, but we think it does. That's when you get misunderstanding and escalations into real war. So I think, you know, the lawyers and the politicians and the State Department people around the world, the ministries of foreign affairs and state, have a lot to do to try to get some kind of basic international understanding of what the rules of the road are. Even if a country decides to violate them, at least everybody understands what they are and knows the risk they're taking if they do violate them. Right now, it's just the Wild West.
Agree. Just a couple more here. And perhaps getting back to more practical immediacy, how vulnerable are our private emails today, i.e. between two persons using their Gmail or Yahoo account? And how about online banking? How secure is that? Can this be made more secure? I'm sure each of us can do something in our computers, but is there something in the infrastructure that's vulnerable?
Well, there's no magic bullet. We certainly can do a lot to prevent making it easy for bad guys to come in terms of, you know, how we set up our passwords, what we click on when we get an email. I mean, phishing, you know, which is defrauding people into clicking on an email, is still one of the easiest ways to penetrate into your system. And so, I mean, I think that's clearly an issue to look at. The other thing is encryption. At least means that if someone sees your data, they can't read it. And increasingly, I think people are using encrypted platforms to communicate for that reason.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that if you're sending email on a commercial provider, whether it's Gmail or Yahoo or whatever, and you don't have encryption with the person you're communicating with, you should assume at least that the company itself might be scanning your email for advertising purposes, and at worst, that somebody's going to break in and read your communications. The good news there is, unlike 10 years ago, the technology of so-called end-to-end encryption, where I send an email to one of you, and we both have encrypted, and we can only read each other. We're the only ones that can read it. Is much easier and less clunky than it used to be. There's a lot of solutions now where, for example, you just install a piece of software and you put a bracket on the title of your email and type the word encrypt and close the bracket, and I send it to the secretary, and we don't have to even have the same encryption capability on our machines. It will give him a link that allows him to decrypt it. So that's, I guess, recommendation number one. Recommendation number two, and I personally think even still, this is the single most important thing you can do, other than not clicking on links that you don't know the sender sent it, is multi-factor authentication. Enable that on every single app you possibly can, because not only is it an additional security protection, but it's an alert mechanism. So for anybody that doesn't know what I mean, this is where you try to log onto your email or your bank and it texts you a code on your phone to type in. It's not perfect. It's not completely free of potential attack, but it's difficult to attack it. And not only does it protect your security, it also alerts you to someone screwing around. Because if you haven't put your username and password in somewhere and you get a text on your phone saying, here's your code, you know that somebody else did put your username and password in. And that way, you know to change your password.
Thank you. One last question before we revert back to Nora for closing. Is the UN or our countries around the world considering developing an international law prohibiting or limiting cyber espionage between nations? Do you think governments, especially the US, China, Iran, Russia, others, would agree to such a treaty?
Well, let me just go first real quickly on that. If you're really talking about espionage, meaning stealing each other's information, there is zero chance the major powers of the world will ever agree to that. We've been doing it, it's the second oldest profession, right? But there have been attempts to get an agreement on the norms of cyber attack, just to use the colloquial term without getting into a definitional discussion. I'm skeptical about those succeeding, but I think it's absolutely necessary to try. I don't know what your thoughts are, Secretary Chertoff.
No, I agree. And I was on, I co-chaired a global commission on stability in cyberspace that recommended some basic norms. And I know a lot of the private companies have talked about a Geneva Convention for cyberspace. I share your skepticism, Brian. I think there's some hope that at least with a few of the norms, even the Russians and the Chinese might see some value in placing certain things off limits. But it's been a very slow and halting process.
Great.
Secretary Chertoff, thank you so much for your time today. I know everybody valued it. Director Cunningham, thank you very much for moderating. Super discussion, and we really appreciate it. I'd like to finish this segment and turn it over to our chairwoman, Nora.
Okay. Thank you and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Secretary Chertoff. I know he had to leave because of another engagement. Director Cunningham, thank you so much for an engaging and informative event. We certainly learned a lot. My background is in computer science, and I work with the Riverside County Information Technology Department. So this topic of security is a very close topic or cause to my heart. And during the conversation, we talk about private and public sector collaboration, and I definitely agree with that. I think it is absolutely critical moving forward for both business and also government privacies that both entities will have a collaboration with one another. I want to thank all of our attendees, the guests, Rick, Richard, and our staff, and also Bill for joining us today. Our next event will be coming up Thursday of next week at the same time. And we also want to thank our major sponsors, Mr. Mark Johnson and Johnson Foundation, for supporting us today. It is due to their support, financial support, that we are able to keep the lights on. More importantly than anything, as a computer scientist and as someone who values both science and social values, it is important to consider social ethics in our technology development, because unfortunately, sometimes we focus so much on technology, and technology moves very, very fast, much faster than any of the other entities can keep up with that. So integrating social ethics and critical thinking as part of our educational system will certainly be of help and value. So we thank our speakers and also our guests, and wish everyone a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you Thursday of next week for our next webinar series. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.